Okay, lymphatic system and immunity. And some books will talk about the immune system kind of separately, but there's really no reason to do that. But again, the video gives a good introduction on the crash course ADP. So if you didn't get a chance to see that, or even if you did, you may want to go back and watch that again. So the introductory video on the lymphatic system. So we'll talk about the different components and the organs and their functions. We'll talk about the lymphatic vessels themselves and their similarities and differences from the other vessels of the circulatory system. Lymph collecting vessels, we'll talk about lymphedema, the different classes of lymphocytes, their importance, their distribution. We'll talk about the lymphoid tissues, we'll trace lymph flow through the lymph nodes, talk about the structure and function of the thymus, and talk about the structure and function of the spleen and trace the blood flow through the spleen. So first of all, the lymphatic system includes your cells, tissues, and organs that are responsible for immunity, but also maintaining your normal blood volume and composition of the interstitial fluid. And remember, interstitial fluid is the fluid that's basically between the cells. When we talk about immunity, that's your ability to resist infection and disease. And any of the cells and tissues that will be involved in immunity, we say are part of the immune system. So let's look at some of the cells that are a part of the lymphatic system. So first of all, you know, we talked about leukocytes and erythrocytes as being types of blood cells. Erythrocytes are the red blood cells. Leukocytes are white blood cells. And as far as types of white blood cells now, we're going to start with lymphocytes. They're considered the primary cells of the lymphatic system. They respond to the invading pathogens, like bacteria and viruses. And the word pathogens means disease-causing. They also respond to any abnormal body cells, like virus-infected cells or cancer cells. So the only way your body can take care of, say, a virus is to actually destroy the cell that it infects. And of course, the only way to deal with cancer is to destroy the cell that's cancerous. But also lymphocytes will respond to any foreign proteins, like bacterial toxins. And there's a few examples of bacteria out there that produce toxins, like the botulinum toxin, causes botulism. The lymphatic system is surrounded by lymph, and this is the interstitial fluid that enters into the lymphatic vessels. We'll often refer to the lymphatic vessels as the lymphatics. They begin in the peripheral tissues, they end at the connections to the veins, so they do cycle back the liquids into the veins, which then return to the heart. And this diagram on the right of this picture shows you some of the distribution of those vessels. And wherever those vessels come together, and you see a point there, that's a lymph node. So these are scattered throughout the body. The primary lymphoid tissues and organs, these are sites where the lymphocytes are going to be formed or they mature. This includes the red bone marrow and the thymus. So again, all the blood cells are being produced by bone marrow, but maturation of these types of cells are in other parts of the body. The secondary lymphoid tissues and organs, these are where the lymphocytes are activated and cloned or copied, and that includes the lymph nodes, your tonsils, your mucosal associated lymphoid tissue or MALT, the appendix, and the spleen. And yes, we do include the appendix now when we talk about lymphoid tissue. For years, we just thought it was kind of a material that had no use whatsoever, that it was a vestigial structure kind of left over, through time. Let's look closer at the lymphatic vessels. They carry the lymph from the peripheral tissues to the venous system. They are found very closely associated with your blood vessels. And the network begins with the lymphatic capillaries. These are the smallest vessels. They're different than the blood capillaries, however. They're closed at one end. They also have larger diameters. They have thinner walls. The basement membranes, incomplete or absent altogether. And they have flattened or irregular outlines in their sectional views. Now, if you see them in color, say on a model or in a color picture, usually we show them as a greenish color for some reason. We distinguish that from veins and arteries being red and blue. They have overlapping endothelial cells. These regions of overlap basically act as one-way valves. They permit entry of the fluid and solutes, which include proteins, and they even allow viruses and bacteria and cell debris to enter, but they prevent the return of the materials to the intercellular spaces. The lymph flows into the larger lymphatic vessels and then leads to the body's trunk. The smaller and medium-sized lymphatic vessels have valves that are located close together. The vessels bulge wherever there is a valve. And whenever you have a series of these bulges, it looks like you have a string of pearls in the picture or on the model. You have lower pressure in the lymphatic vessels. The valves do prevent backflow of lymph, like the veins do. And again, very similarly to the veins, contraction of the surrounding skeletal muscle helps the flow of the lymph. And again, when you are bedridden in, say, the hospital, they do have the compression devices now that blow up and they deflate regularly, and they're helping in this movement. Keep you from getting edema. So this shows what some of those vessels look like. Let's talk about where we find some lymphatic vessels. So in the small intestine, we have prominent lymphatic capillaries we call lacteals. And some of their purpose is to transport lipids that are absorbed from the digestive tract. There are areas that lack lymphatic capillaries, though, like areas without a blood supply. The cornea of the eye is a good example. So how do we prevent backflow of lymph in the lymphatic vessels? What's in there? Yeah, what are those called? Like they're in veins. A valve, right. And what helps also in pushing the material through the lymph tissue? How does flow occur? The surrounding materials, and what are they doing around these vessels? Constricting. Yeah, the muscles are contracting, which constrict those vessels and push the fluids forward. Okay. The superficial lymphatics, these are subcutaneous layers that are into the skin. Areolar tissues of the mucous membranes, like digestive, respiratory, urinary, reproductive tracts. Areolar tissues of the serous membranes, the pleural, pericardial, peritoneal cavities. Then we have what we call the deep lymphatics. Those accompany the deep arteries and veins that supply the skeletal muscles and the other organs of the neck, the limbs and trunk, and the wall of the visceral organs. So this graphic shows some of the superficial lymphatics on the left and the deep lymphatics on the right. Here are the collecting vessels. So the superficial and deep lymphatics converge and they form lymphatic trunks, which will then empty into the thoracic duct, which collects lymph from the entire body that's inferior to the diaphragm, and the left side of the body that's superior to the diaphragm. And these will drain into the left subclavian vein, and the left subclavian vein then goes where? See if you can remember from the previous chapter. eventually into what?
Eventually into the brachias.
Right, and then to the superior vena cava and into the heart. Okay, then the right lymphatic duct, it collects lymph from the right side of the body superior to the diaphragm, and then it drains into the right subclavian vein. Same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so this shows some of the distribution. So the right lymphatic duct is formed by merging of the right jugular trunk, the right subclavian trunk, and the right bronchomediastinal trunk. The thoracic duct, it collects lymph from the left bronchomediastinal trunk, the left subclavian trunk, and the left jugular trunk. So this shows that distribution in the collection ducts. Okay, at the base of the thoracic ducts, we have these expanded sac-like chambers we call the cisterna chyli. They receive the lymph from the inferior part of the abdomen, the pelvis, the lower limbs. And then lymph is drained into the cisterna chyli through the lumbar trunks and the intestinal trunks. You may have heard of lymphedema before. This is caused when you have a blockage in the lymphatic drainage. So the interstitial fluids accumulate, the effect area become very swollen and distended, like in this picture. And quite often we see this in limbs, but it could happen in other places. The swelling could be permanent, where the connective tissue loses its elasticity. And one of the problems if this interstitial fluid becomes stagnant is it can accumulate toxins and pathogens, and then you get your local immune defenses becoming overwhelmed. Okay, let's talk about some of the specific cells now. The lymphocytes. They make up 20 to 40% of the circulating leukocytes. And again, leukocytes is just another term for white blood cells. Most lymphocytes are out in the lymphatic tissues, and there's 3 classes that circulate. T cells are about 80% of the lymphocytes. These are involved in what we call cell-mediated immunity. The B cells are 10 to 15% of the circulating lymphocytes. They're involved in antibody-mediated immunity. So they're the cells that will be responsible for ultimately producing antibodies. And then we have NK cells. That stands for natural killer cells. That's 5 to 10% of the circulating lymphocytes. And they're involved in what we call immune surveillance. They're kind of going around your system, the tissues, and the lymphatics, looking for foreign things and pathogens. But all the classes of lymphocytes are sensitive to specific chemicals we call antigens. So an antigen is something that is foreign. And they're usually going to be pathogens, foreign proteins, or abnormal substances. And they stimulate an immune response, which will normally lead to destruction of the target compound, or if the organism is foreign inside of you. Sometimes you'll see some books call it an immunogen if it's an antigen that elicits a strong immune response. But again, an antigen really is just this simple thing your body is recognizing as foreign, as not self, not itself. Okay, we do even have different classes of the T cells. There's cytotoxic T cells that attack the foreign cells and the body cells that are infected by viruses. And usually this is through direct contact. The primary cells are involved in production of what we call cell-mediated immunity, or cellular immunity. Helper T cells, these stimulate activation and function of T cells and B cells. They're kind of a go-between, which we'll talk more about later. And they activate B cells before the B cells produce antibodies. You have regulatory T cells that moderate the immune responses. They control sensitivity of the immune response. And then you have memory T cells. They respond to antigens that they've already encountered. It's the memory T cells, at least on the T cell side, that are responsible for the T cell immunity, or longer term immunity. We also have memory B cells that we'll talk about. Because the B cells, when they're stimulated, they turn into plasma cells and they produce and secrete antibodies. So they're responsible for antibody-mediated immunity, or another term we use is humoral immunity. And the antibodies circulate throughout your fluids. They attack the targets throughout the body. Okay, so let's go back a little bit and talk specifically about some of these cells. So on the T cell lymphocyte side, the natural killer cells, they attack foreign cells, the virus-infected body cells, and the cancer cells. They provide the continuous monitoring of your peripheral tissues, again, what we call immune surveillance. Okay, so this is a good chart to remember the lymphocytes by. Again, 4 kinds of T cells: cytotoxic, helper, regulatory, and memory. Then we have the B cells and the natural killer cells on the other side. Lymphocyte production is called lymphopoiesis. This involves the red bone marrow, your thymus, your peripheral lymphoid tissues. But the primary role of the red bone marrow, it maintains your normal lymphocyte population. So you have hematopoietic stem cells that produce lymphoid stem cells. Again, hematopoietic stem cells produce all of those blood cells, but specifically you have some producing lymphoid stem cells. And they produce all the lymphocyte types from 2 groups. One group is going to migrate to your thymus, and they'll develop into T cells. By the way, that's one of the reasons we call them T cells, because of the thymus. The second group stays in the red bone marrow and divides to produce B cells. And then they mature and move into the lymph nodes, the spleen, and the other lymphoid tissues. Anybody want to make a guess why we call them B cells?
Bone marrow. So bone.
Not a bad guess. Bone marrow is not a bad guess. Actually, it's because we discovered them in this organ in birds called the Bursa fabricius. So that's not going to help you very much.
No,
But,
I'll just remember bone and B cells.
yeah, just remember, and that's very helpful. I mean, of course, all of them come from bone marrow, but the B cells will mature in the lymph nodes, spleen, and lymphoid tissues. T cells mature in the thymus. And remember, the thymus is right above the heart. And don't get that mixed up with the thyroid gland that's much higher up on the trachea and the voice box. Natural killer cells, they mature and migrate throughout your body, and they patrol the peripheral tissues. The development of the stem cells in the thymus, they're isolated from your general circulation by the blood-thymus barrier. They divide in response to thymic hormones that produce all the types of T cells. The T cells undergo selection processes. They ensure they won't react to your normal body cells, and up to 98% of the T cells are deselected and die. So your body basically initially produces T cells that will recognize every kind of antigen initially. And then your body, and we'll talk about this later on, as it goes and becomes confident, it gets rid of all the ones that recognize itself, so it doesn't destroy itself. So the majority of them do get deselected. The mature T cells re-enter the bloodstream. They travel to the peripheral lymphoid tissues and the organs. Okay, so that is lymphocytopoiesis. Okay, I think we will stop right there.